Welcome to the Deep Dive. Our mission here is to take deep breaths and even deeper dives into the sources, uncovering knowledge that changes the way we see the world.
And today, we are really focusing in.
We're looking at a figure who exists in just one verse of the entire Bible, yet whose single invention, you could say, defines the culture of God's people for millennia. We're talking about Jabal.
It's such a rewarding challenge, isn't it? Looking at a name so briefly mentioned. I mean, most readers, you just skip right over the genealogies in Genesis 4.
Of course you do.
But when you pause on that one verse, Genesis 4, verse 20, it opens up an entire world. It's a profound moment of human innovation right at the beginning of history.
And that one verse, just to remind everyone, reads, Ada gave birth to Jabal. He was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock.
And that's it. That's all we get.
His whole life summed up in a single sentence. But the sources we've been exploring make this really bold claim that this brief introduction is a watershed moment, not just in history, but in the unfolding story of redemption.
It absolutely is.
So we want to understand how his work provided the essential cultural and even theological context for figures like Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
It's completely foundational. When we study these early chapters of Genesis, even in the troubled lineage of Cain, we're constantly reminded of that enduring creative image of God that's imprinted on humanity.
Right.
Jabal didn't just tend a few animals. He established an entire organized way of life, a structure, an economy, a migratory pattern. And this cultural scaffolding is what enables us to understand the practical realities of the patriarchs' lives.
How they moved, how they lived.
Exactly. How they amassed wealth and how they related to the land and ultimately to God.
That sounds like a heavy load for just one verse to carry, but I can already see how the context of the patriarchs is entirely nomadic. So let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We'll begin by diving into the specific historical and cultural background of the life Jabal pioneered. Then we'll move into how that work fits within the broader biblical narrative.
And after that, we can pull the threads together.
Yes, and synthesize the profound theological significance of these gifts, and then conclude with some practical spiritual lessons for our lives today.
Sounds good.
So let's start with the sheer necessity of this lifestyle. The sources suggest that pastoral nomadism wasn't some kind of, early vacation plan.
No, not at all.
It was a hardcore survival strategy born out of ecological constraints. Why did this need for mobility arise in the first place?
Well, it arose from the very limits of the land and the climate. You have to imagine a world where human populations are growing, but the best agricultural resources, reliable water, rich topsoil, they're all concentrated in these narrow river valleys.
Right.
Outside of those fertile strips, the land is semi-arid. It's characterized by uncertain rainfall and these scattered patches of temporary pasture.
So if you try to farm there,
You're taking a huge risk. If you commit to farming permanent fields in that kind of environment, you risk total catastrophic loss in a single dry year.
so survival meant adapting to the land's rhythm rather than trying to force the land to adapt to you.
Exactly. That's the key insight. The solution was nomadism. If the resource itself is mobile like scattered pasture, then your economy has to be mobile too.
It's the only way.
It's the only way to survive. You have to follow the temporary pastures, relying on seasonal weather patterns, always looking for the next place where the animals can graze. It was an economic and logistical solution to a very harsh reality. It demanded real ingenuity.
And the centerpiece of that ingenuity, as the verse says, is the tent. He was the father of those who live in tents. That phrase alone asks us to look deeply at the technology and sociology of this portable architecture. What was the material science behind these early tents?
It's really amazing how efficient and honestly technologically advanced they were for their time. We're not talking about simple canvas tarps here.
Right.
These tents were generally woven from goat hair specifically, the long black hair of the domestic goat. And this material has two critical properties that make it just perfect for the nomadic life in the Near East.
Okay, so what are those properties?
First, when it's hot, the loosely woven fibers allow air to circulate, creating the sort of natural chimney effect that keeps the inside shaded and ventilated. But second, and this is crucial, when those torrential rains fall, the natural goat hair fibers swell up, they absorb the moisture, and the swelling seals the weave, creating a surprisingly effective, self-sealing, waterproof barrier.
It's like nature's own smart fabric.
It really is.
So it's durable, it's self-regulating, and it's perfectly adapted to the rapid shifts in weather you see in that region. But what about the labor involved? packing up your entire house must have been grueling.
Oh, it was immense, persistent labor, and it was often carried out by the women of the camp. The tent itself wasn't a single enormous sheet.
Right.
It was constructed of these long, narrow strips which could be easily separated, rolled up, and loaded onto the backs of donkeys or camels. This portability defined their entire existence.
So the whole system was designed for movement.
The whole domestic system, from the looms to the cooking hearths, was designed to be quickly mended, collapsed, and then re-erected in a new location, sometimes within just a few hours.
And I think we often overlook how the tent functioned as the singular space for life itself. It wasn't just, a bedroom.
No, not at all. It was the entire universe of the family unit. The source material really emphasizes this holistic nature. While it was standing, that tent served every necessary communal function. It was the house for shelter, the chapel for family worship,
The workshop.
the workshop where tools were repaired, wool was processed, the nursery for the young, and the council room where these huge life-and-death logistical decisions were made. The structure literally embodied the portability of their culture, their economy, and their faith.
And this portable architecture supported an entirely new concept of economics, which the source rightly calls wealth on the hoof. Before Jabal, wealth was likely tied to land, right? Crops or some static possession. How did livestock change the whole concept of capital?
It shifted capital from being a static possession to being a living, reproductive asset. And the focus was heavily on small ruminants, so sheep and goats. These animals were incredibly versatile, and they required much less high-quality feed than, say, cattle. They were the engine of subsistence.
What made them so uniquely valuable?
Well, they provided both immediate necessities and long-term capital growth. They supplied milk, which was vital and could be processed into curds and cheeses, shelf-stable food that could be stored and traded.
And, of course, wool.
They offered wool for textiles and hides for leather goods and the tents themselves. And meat was certainly available, but it was usually reserved for hospitality or sacrifice or major celebrations because killing an animal meant liquidating your capital.
So they were a liquid, reproducible investment.
Exactly that. The central economic insight Jabal established was that a herd of livestock is a living savings account. Unlike a field of grain that yields once and is utterly dependent on static rainfall, a herd breeds new value and new capital every single season.
That's a huge deal.
This system of accumulation provided both insurance against a localized drought and the ability to grow wealth exponentially over generations. This innovation is absolutely essential for understanding the biblical timeline that follows.
And that's the connection we need to cement here, I think. When we later read that Abram in Genesis 13 was very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold, that description doesn't just float in the air, does it?
Not at all.
Jabal's prior work made that conceptual possibility real. He established the entire framework for how you could accumulate wealth through mobility.
That's the perfect way to synthesize this. Jabal didn't just invent a hobby. He invented a reliable, reproducible, and mobile economic system that allowed people to thrive in marginal lands. He bridged the gap between, say, a hunter-gatherer economy and the highly structured, fluid economy of the patriarchs.
And this mobility wasn't just about survival. It became a civilizational engine, fostering social and trade networks. I was surprised by the idea that moving constantly actually increased social connection, rather than isolating people.
It's a paradox, isn't it? But you have to remember the context. Survival in this environment demands cooperation and shared knowledge. The social organization required for moving families and herds involved intense diplomacy.
How so?
They needed shared knowledge of the location of permanent wells, temporary seasonal springs, and established grazing corridors, all resources that were often claimed by others.
So this is why we see all those conflicts over water rights later in Genesis. Isaac reopening his father's wells in Genesis 26. That wasn't just about accessing water, was it?
No, it was about asserting historic rights. Rights to mobility and resources that allowed their entire economy to function. Those wells were legal and cultural waypoints. They represented established grazing agreements and lines of social authority. Without them, their wealth on the hoof was useless.
And mobility also fostered trade.
It did. The nomads had essential high-value items to exchange: dairy, processed hides, wool. They exchanged these for grain, pottery, and metalwork from the settled city dwellers.
So in a way, the herders essentially became the delivery service of the ancient world.
In many ways, yes. Their movements stitched regions together, connecting these disparate settled communities. And they carried more than just goods. They carried songs, stories, news. Mobility became a vector for cultural transmission, connecting the cradle of civilization and speeding up the pace of innovation across the entire Near East.
To manage this demanding life, dealing with the land, the animals, the trade, it must have demanded an exceptional level of skill. The source suggests Jabal's legacy is ultimately one of attentiveness.
That is the ultimate non-material legacy. We tend to reduce the shepherd to a simple laborer, but the role required deep, sophisticated knowledge. They had to be practical astronomers for nighttime navigation.
Of course.
They were meteorologists, reading subtle shifts in wind and cloud patterns to predict weather changes. They were botanists, knowing exactly which plants were edible for the flock, which were poisonous, and where pasture would appear after a specific kind of rainfall.
And beyond the hard sciences, they needed a profound knowledge of animal behavior.
Absolutely. They had to be, in a sense, psychologists, knowing the temperament of every single animal, detecting subtle signs of sickness or distress, and knowing how to gently guide hundreds of animals without force. Their entire life was a study in disciplined, patient responsiveness to the rhythms of creation.
Their success depended completely on their ability to pay rapt attention.
Hour after hour, season after season, yes.
This deep understanding of Jabal's pioneering life really does prepare us for the context of the patriarchs. It establishes the entire cultural texture for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
It connects the dots perfectly, doesn't it? We no longer see Abraham's life as randomly imposed, but as a direct continuation of the successful, established culture. When Abraham entertains the three messengers in Genesis 18, he is sitting at the entrance of his tent during the heat of the day.
A common practice.
A known, common cultural practice for hospitality and for managing the family unit.
And the practical reality of their identification.
Well, you see, Jacob, after his long journey, building those temporary structures, the Sukkoth or booths, for his livestock. And even later, when Joseph brings his entire family down to Egypt, they identify themselves simply and strategically to Pharaoh. Your servants are shepherds. We have come to live here a while.
They weren't lying.
They weren't lying. They used Jabal's established profession as their cultural identity, one that Pharaoh would have understood instantly. This entire identity and lifestyle presumes the innovation of Jabal hundreds of years prior.
Okay, so now let's move into the biblical narrative, because here's where it really requires some thoughtful examination. Jabal's innovation wasn't isolated. It occurred within the immediate and very dark context of Lamech's genealogy. It was part of this simultaneous ascent of culture.
This is one of the most sobering and fascinating sections in Genesis 4. Jabal, the father of organized provision, is quickly followed by his brothers. You have Jubal, who becomes the father of those who play stringed instruments and pipes, bringing beauty and order through music.
And then Cain.
And then their half-brother, Tubal-Cain, forges the tools of bronze and iron-bringing craft, metallurgy, and advanced technology.
So provision, beauty, and craft, the three major pillars of human civilization, all emerging in the same generation, outside of the line of promise, the line of Seth. It suggests that the Genesis mandate to subdue the earth continues to manifest itself powerfully, even after the human heart has fallen away from God.
That's the great tension. The image of God is resilient. It means humanity remains capable of these amazing cultural gifts and structural advancement. But the text doesn't allow us to simply celebrate this cultural progress, does it?
Oh.
It immediately forces us to consider the weight of Jabal's title, father of those who live in tents and raise livestock.
It's more than just a description. It's an origin story, a statement of foundation.
Absolutely. The title, father of those, marks him as the originator, the founder of a persistent system. Before Jabal, people may have, randomly grazed a few sheep. After him, herding solidifies into a predictable, reproducible way of life, a structure defined by organized skill sets and required pilgrimage routes.
He provides the blueprint.
He provides the blueprint for an entire civilization, one that emphasizes movement and temporary settlement.
And this emphasis on the temporary, on the tent, is what carries such profound theological weight later. The sources make an immediate, profound connection between the physical tent and the imagery we find later in the book of Hebrews.
This connection is the hinge. It's what turns a cultural observation into a deep theological insight. Hebrews 11, the great chapter of faith, describes Abraham's life this way. It says he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob,
Heirs of the same promise.
who were heirs with him of the same promise. The tent is a physical reality that embodies the spiritual reality of their pilgrimage.
It becomes what the source calls a sacrament of hope.
Exactly. I love that phrase. Think about the daily reality.
Ah.
Every day, Abraham and his family are reminded that their home is not static, not fixed, and not ultimate. The tent, that mobile, collapsible structure, becomes a visible, daily testament to transience.
It forces their gaze upward.
Upward and forward. That's why the text goes on to say that Abraham acted this way, for he was looking forward to the city with foundations whose architect and builder is God.
The temporary structure sustains them in the present.
But it prevents them from settling down and confusing the promised land with the ultimate destination. They are sustained by temporary structures while actively seeking eternal ones. That is the very essence of pilgrimage.
It's fascinating how this pastoral life, the very life established by Jabal, then provides so much of vocabulary for divine revelation.
It moves from a common cultural experience to a shared spiritual metaphor. The Old Testament is just saturated with it. We see David himself, plucked from the sheep fields, appointed as the shepherd king, singing Psalm 23, "The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing."
Such a powerful image.
And the prophet Isaiah, preparing the people for the return from exile, offers this vision of incredible tenderness in Isaiah 40:11. He envisions the Lord gathering the flock with an intimate care that only a true shepherd could understand.
And this theme culminates, of course, with Christ.
Precisely. Jesus claimed the ultimate pastoral title, moving beyond metaphor to identification. In John 10, he declares, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." This is the fulfillment. The entire shared cultural vocabulary that started with Jabal's practical daily care is taken up, refined, and fulfilled in Christ's saving work.
But we have to address the stark paradox here. This incredible cultural ascent, the music, the metallurgy, the organized flocks, it's immediately juxtaposed with profound moral decay, encapsulated in Jabal's own family line.
That is the inescapable tension of Genesis 4, and it is a crucial theological point. Cultural advancement is celebrated, but it's side by side with Lamech's violent boasting. Lamech, Jabal's father, openly multiplies violence. He declares, "I have killed a man for wounding me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times.
So humanity is capable of amazing creation and utter depravity at the exact same time.
Yes. The highest human achievements in technology and art are walking hand in hand with the deepest human rebellion. The skills Jabal taught provided food and life, but the heart that used those skills was bent towards self-glorification and murderous revenge.
Sobering.
The story of Jabal is immediately followed by the pre-flood verdict in Genesis 6. Every inclination of the thoughts of the human heart was only evil all the time.
That is a powerful reminder that we cannot equate cultural success with moral character. Jabal's craft sustains life, but the hearts that use the gifts are bent toward death. That paradox is the defining reality right up until the judgment of the flood. Let's move into the theological significance then, because Jabal's story really clarifies several major doctrines. First, how does his skill reflect the enduring doctrine of the image of God?
Well, it's a powerful testament to human design, isn't it? Even though Jabal and his family are outside the line of covenant faith, that Genesis 1 mandate echoes forward. Humans were commanded to fill the earth and subdue it.
And that's what he's doing.
That's exactly what he's doing. Jabal's creation of a complex, sustainable system for managing and reproducing livestock is an active expression of subduing the earth and exercising creative dominion.
So his pastoral skill transforms the general command of dominion into something, well, something ethical and practical.
It transforms it into stewardship. Dominion, in this sense, is not exploitation. It's the ordered, responsible care of God's creatures for the common good of humanity. The image of God is resilient. It means that the inherent capacity for innovation, structure, and productive work is innate to every human, regardless of their spiritual condition before God.
And that leads directly to the concept of common grace. Jabal is in the line of Cain, yet God allows him and his family to create these essential elements of civilization. How do we define and appreciate that concept?
Common grace is the goodness and kindness of God extended indiscriminately to all humanity, believers and unbelievers alike. Psalm 145 confirms this. He is good to all. He has compassion on all he's made.
So these gifts aren't limited to the faithful.
No. The gifts from the line of Cain, the economic stability of Jabal, the beauty of Jubal, the practical utility of Tubal-Cain, all of these things feed, clothe, and dignify human life. God's sun rises on the righteous and the unrighteous, ensuring that human culture and civilization can continue, even amidst moral failure.
But we have to be so careful there. While this generosity sustains life, It never excuses rebellion or substitutes for saving faith.
That is the most critical theological distinction embedded in Genesis 4. We must clearly separate cultural achievement from covenant fellowship. Jabal's ingenuity is remarkable. It is not redemption.
We see brilliant advances. The lyre, the forge, the tent, all sitting right alongside Lamech's murderous pride. The text gently but firmly cautions us against confusing cultural brilliance with character or salvation.
It reminds me of the question Jesus asked later in Matthew 16. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world, yet forfeit their soul? That verse just pierces the illusion that human brilliance can solve our spiritual problem.
So Jabal's culture belongs to human history.
Yes, the broad unfolding of human history and survival. But the promises that define Israel, the covenants, and the salvation that gathers the church, that unfolds by special revelation and sovereign grace. The shepherd's craft gives God a familiar language to speak in, but it does not, and it cannot save the soul.
Moving back to the actual daily life of the herder, this practice itself seems to have been an ongoing lesson in providence. How did nomadic herding train people in faith, or at least independence?
It was a continuous, practical lesson in looking upward. Shepherds had skill and knowledge, but they could not control the most vital elements: water and weather. They had to watch constantly for pasture that appears only after the rain.
He can make it rain.
They can't. They had to plan their migrations based on nature's rhythms, not their own rigid timelines. This required active, persistent looking for provision that comes from outside themselves.
So the hard labor was constantly reinforcing the need for dependence.
Yes, and this practical labor becomes the framework for spiritual faith later on. The daily mercies that sustain Jabal's world, finding a fresh well, a lamb safely birthed, a quiet night where no predator attacked, they became physical metaphors for the Father's reliable daily care.
It's James 1:17.
Every good and perfect gift is from above. What the shepherd learned by hard labor and vigilance, the believer learns by trust. Providence is not an abstract idea. It's seen, tasted, and depended upon daily in nomadic life.
And ultimately, this legacy positioned the culture as a critical vessel for divine revelation.
God uses what is known to reveal what is eternal. He established this cultural pattern through Jabal, and then he selected his covenant people from within it. He calls Abraham a man perfectly comfortable with tents and flocks. He disciplines Jacob through 2 decades of intense shepherding. He prepares David for kingship, not in a palace, but among the sheep.
He uses the language they understand.
He frames his heart toward Israel using shepherd terms constantly. And finally, he sends the ultimate shepherd to gather his people, both Jew and Gentile, under his protective voice. The culture becomes the common ground for special revelation.
We've spent a good deal of time on the history and theology. Let's bring this ancient life into our modern context. What does the spirit of Jabal the shepherd teach us about how we live today? The first lesson the essay points to is the necessity of patience.
The pastoral life is defined by its pace, isn't it? It moves at the speed of seasons, not the speed of a startup or a financial quarter. There are no shortcuts. When rain is late, the shepherd can't seize the rain, nor can he panic. He waits, he washes, and he maintains the discipline of movement and care.
That's profound training for the soul.
It teaches us to receive the timing of provision, rather than attempting to force the outcome through anxious activity.
So in a world of instant gratification and 247 news cycles, how does that translate into steadiness for us, for the believer?
Well, it translates directly into our planning and our rest. We're called to be diligent, responsible planners. Proverbs 16 says humans plan their course, but ultimately, the Lord establishes their steps. Patience means doing the diligent work of planning, but then releasing the outcome to God.
Our faith turns planning into petition.
Exactly. We adopt the shepherd's unhurried, patient watchfulness, knowing that provision is guaranteed, even if the timing is not our own.
That patient watchfulness requires deep focus, which leads us to the second lesson, the discipline of attentiveness.
The shepherd had to be intensely, almost surgically observant. They had to read light and shadow, distinguishing the subtle sound of a small predator from the sound of the wind, noticing a slight change in the grazing pattern of the flock.
It's a hyper-awareness of the environment, a skill we've largely lost.
I think so.
So how do we apply that spiritual attentiveness when we are constantly barraged by noise and distraction?
We need to learn to scan our spiritual horizon with that same focus. We have to listen for that subtle drift in the heart, those small, almost imperceptible compromises that erode trust or create distance from God before they escalate into massive failures.
We tend to only notice the large spiritual disasters.
But the shepherd catches the small signs of disease or danger early. And this attentiveness extends beyond ourselves, doesn't it?
It has to.
That's where the confidence of Psalm 23 comes in. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. If you truly believe you lack nothing essential, it gives you permission to shift your focus away from your own desperate needs and truly notice others.
You could look up and look out.
You notice the neighbor whose quiet sadness calls for simple, unprompted care. You notice the colleague who needs a word of encouragement that requires you to actually stop and see them. Spiritual attentiveness means being present in the moment God gives us and responding to the quiet needs we detect.
A third application from the pastoral life concerns stewardship and boundaries. The essay suggests that livestock thrived only within wise limits.
This is a profound ethical lesson. The limits placed on the flock weren't always physical fences. They were often fences of time, of habit, of disciplinary rotation. The shepherd knew precisely when to move the flock to let a pasture rest and recover. Without those wise limits, the flock would destroy the land and eventually themselves.
And we, the descendants of this inventive line, have far more potent tools and gifts than Jabal ever did.
We do. Our technologies, our wealth, our influence, all of this amplifies human reach far beyond the ancient world. But these powerful gifts and innovations require boundaries shaped by God's character, not our own ambition.
Because the line of Cain produced both the tools and Lamech's arrogant boast. We have to separate the gifts from the pride.
That is the continuous challenge for the believer. We're called to keep the innovation, to use our skills, our technology, our resources, and renounce the arrogance that seeks to use them purely for self-exaltation. We must steward everything, setting wise boundaries on our time and our consumption so that everything we do is used for the glory of God, as 1 Corinthians 10 says.
The limits ensure the gifts serve God and our neighbor, not just our own ego.
That's right.
Another modern challenge is that we often confuse constant activity with actual progress, leading to a restlessness that produces very little fruit. This brings us to the distinction between motion and mission.
The nomadic shepherd moved out of clear necessity and purpose. Their movement was purposeful survival, not frenzy. The challenge for us today is what we might call digital restlessness. That feeling of constant motion, of checking every notification, replying to every email instantly.
It feels like a momentum.
It feels like momentum, but it often produces very little lasting, purposeful fruit in God's kingdom.
The shepherd's pace, then, becomes the countermodel for the modern age.
It is purposeful, it is watchful, and crucially, it is interruptible. The shepherd is prepared to stop everything to attend to a single distressed lamb. This rhythm resembles the unhurried movement of Jesus, who moved constantly from town to town, performing great works, but never seemed harried or anxious.
Seeking the kingdom first reorders everything.
It reorders our priorities and helps us discern the essential mission from mere activity.
Finally, the heritage of Jabal, the tent life, it calls us to ultimate hope beyond this temporary structure.
This is the conclusion of the entire theological framework. The tent is the ultimate symbol of the transient. Abraham lived in them to force his attention toward the ultimate permanent destination. This means that believers today are called to honor their earthbound callings, whether we're in labs, classrooms, workshops, or managing businesses, while never forgetting that all of our earthly making and managing points beyond this life.
We live faithfully in the field, not because it's our final home, but because we're actively watching for the city with foundations, whose architect and builder is God. Our life in the world is defined by movement toward the next.
Well said.
So what does this all mean for us today? Jabal, the father of tents and flocks, gives us this profound legacy of endurance, of necessary abundance, and the foundational language by which God would eventually describe his most intimate care for his people. We learn that the shepherd's ingenuity is a result of God's common grace, but his story also provides a stark warning. Cultural achievement, however impressive, when it's separated from worship, quickly devolves into violence and pride.
It does.
We're summoned to receive God's good gifts with joy and steward them with humility, always maintaining the perspective of the pilgrim.
And if we carry that image of the shepherd and the flock through the entire narrative, from Jabal's practical tents all the way to Abraham's spiritual pilgrimage, we realize that the ultimate fulfillment of this metaphor is found in the deep tenderness of God himself. We should return to that beautiful, encouraging passage from Isaiah 40.11.
Please.
It summarizes the final, perfect fulfillment of the pastoral image. He tends his flock like a shepherd. He gathers the lambs in his arms and carries them close to his heart. He gently leads those that have young.
That image is immense encouragement. It shows us a God defined by both intimacy and strength. He doesn't just manage the flock from a distance. He gathers the most vulnerable, the lambs in his arms, and carries them close.
And he demonstrates such extraordinary patience, gently leads those that have young, those who must move slowly and deliberately. This is the ultimate model of stewardship and attentive care.
We can be confident that the strength of the shepherd is perfectly matched by his profound tenderness towards you. Let that confidence define your week. Embrace both the steady, necessary work of your callings and the ultimate identity of the pilgrim. May you walk in the knowledge that the one who taught Jabal to find water in the dry land still leads you beside quiet waters and is steadily bringing you home.